Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The first time Agent Lim saw the footage, he thought it was a technical error. The timestamp read 3:17 in the morning, and the thermal imaging drone hovered 2 floors above the old St. Catherine's School for Girls in Georgetown, Penang. The building had been closed since 1987, left to rot in the humid Malaysian air, its iron gates chained and rusted. But on the screen, a heat signature moved steadily through the second-floor corridor. It wasn't the movement itself that made Lim's hand freeze on the mouse, it was the angle. The figure was walking upside down, pressed against the ceiling, its head dangling toward the floor tiles below. The shape was unmistakable, a long habit, the silhouette of a veil, the slow, deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Lim replayed it 3 times before calling his superior. By dawn, a full investigative team was being assembled. Agent Lim had worked for the Malaysian Special Investigations Unit for nearly 12 years, and in that time he had seen things that made him question the boundaries of what was explainable. The unit operated in the shadows, funded quietly by the federal government, tasked with investigating incidents that couldn't be handled by ordinary police. These were cases involving mass hysteria, unexplained deaths, and locations that seemed to defy the natural order. St. Catherine's had been on their watch list for years. Locals avoided it. Schoolchildren crossed the street rather than walk past its crumbling walls. There had been reports before. Faint singing heard at night. Lights flickering in windows that had no power, but nothing concrete enough to warrant a full deployment. Until now. The drone footage changed everything. It wasn't just an anomaly. It was evidence. Something was inside that building, and it was moving with purpose. Lim had been chosen to lead the team because of his background in both forensic analysis and cultural anthropology. He understood the region's history, the layers of colonialism, religion, and superstition that had soaked into the soil. St. Catherine's had been built in 1903 by French missionaries, a place meant to educate the daughters of wealthy families. But it had closed abruptly after a series of incidents involving the nuns themselves. The official records were vague, mentioning only health complications and structural concerns, but local stories told a different tale. They spoke of a nun who had lost her mind, who had been found in the chapel covered in her own blood, whispering prayers in a language no one recognized. Some said she had been possessed. Others said she had invited something in. Whatever the truth, the school had never reopened, and the church had sealed the property without ceremony or explanation. The team arrived at St. Catherine's just before noon, 6 agents in total, each equipped with standard gear, flashlights, recording devices, portable scanners, and respirators in case the air quality inside was compromised. The front gate had been forced open sometime in the last few weeks. The chain cut cleanly through, and the courtyard beyond was overgrown with weeds and tangled vines that crept up the walls like veins. The main building loomed ahead, 3 stories of pale stone stained with mold and streaked with rust from the broken gutters above. The windows were dark, most of them shattered, and the air smelled of rot and something else, something faintly metallic that clung to the back of Lim's throat. He motioned for the team to spread out, 2 agents checking the perimeter, 2 more setting up a mobile command station in the courtyard, while he and Agent Tan, a younger officer with a sharp eye for detail, prepared to enter the building. Before stepping inside, Lim reviewed the drone footage one more time on his tablet. The figure had moved from the east corridor toward the central stairwell, then disappeared near what used to be the chapel. That was where they would start. The front doors were unlocked, hanging slightly ajar as if someone had just stepped through. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. The entrance hall was wide, with a high ceiling and a staircase that curved upward into darkness. To the right, a hallway led toward the old classrooms. To the left, the chapel. Lim's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating peeling paint, broken furniture, and streaks of black mold that spread across the walls like ink stains. Everything was still, too still. Tan whispered something about the silence, how it felt wrong, how even abandoned places usually had sound, wind through broken windows, the creak of settling wood. But here there was nothing, just a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to press against their ears. They moved toward the chapel, their footsteps echoing faintly on the cracked tile floor. The double doors at the end of the hallway were closed, but not locked. Lim pushed one open slowly, wincing as the hinges groaned. Inside, the chapel was smaller than he expected, with rows of wooden pews covered in dust, and a stone altar at the far end beneath a large crucifix that had been turned upside down. The sight of it made something twist in Lim's stomach. It wasn't vandalism, not the chaotic scrawl of teenagers or urban explorers. It had been done carefully, deliberately, with the nails removed and reinserted at precise angles. Tan aimed his flashlight at the walls and froze. The beam revealed long, jagged marks carved into the plaster, deep grooves that ran from floor to ceiling in chaotic patterns. At first, Lim thought they were scratches, claw marks perhaps, but as he stepped closer, he realized they were words, Latin words. The letters were uneven, scorched into the surface as if burned by something impossibly hot, and they repeated over and over in a spiraling pattern that covered the entire wall. Ad servitium daemonis. In service of the demon. Lim felt his pulse quicken. He had studied Latin in university, enough to recognize the phrase, and the implications sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't the work of vandals. This was a declaration. Tan's voice was tight when he spoke, asking if they should call for backup, but Lim shook his head. Not yet. They needed more information, more evidence. He reached for his radio to update the team outside, but before he could speak, the sound came. It started as a faint scraping, like nails dragging across stone, and it seemed to come from above. Both agents looked up at the chapel ceiling, which was stained with water damage and streaked with cracks. The scraping grew louder, more rhythmic, and then there was a thud, sharp and sudden, directly overhead. Something was moving up there. Lim motioned for Tan to stay quiet, and they backed slowly toward the door, keeping their eyes on the ceiling. The thud came again, closer this time, and then another and another, each one tracking their movement as if whatever was above them could see exactly where they stood. Tan's flashlight flickered once, twice, then went out completely. He cursed under his breath and fumbled for his backup light, but before he could turn it on, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lim's own flashlight beam trembled slightly in his hand as he swept it across the room. Nothing had changed. The altar, the pews, the scorched words on the wall, everything was exactly as it had been. But the air felt different now, heavier, charged with something he couldn't name. Then, from the corner of his vision, he saw it. A shadow, tall, thin, standing motionless in the doorway they had just come through. It wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, just standing there in the shape of a person draped in dark fabric. Lim's throat went dry. He turned his flashlight toward it, and the beam passed through empty air. There was nothing there, but he had seen it. He knew he had. Tan grabbed his arm and pointed toward the ceiling again. This time, Lim saw it too. A dark stain was spreading across the plaster directly above them, seeping through the cracks like liquid, and it was moving, crawling outward in thin tendrils that reached toward the walls. The smell hit them next, sharp and acrid, like burning hair and copper. Lim made the decision instantly. They needed to leave. Now. They backed out of the chapel and into the hallway, moving quickly but not running, their training keeping them disciplined even as every instinct screamed at them to flee. Behind them, the chapel doors slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, and the sound of scraping resumed. Louder now, more frantic, as if something was clawing its way through the wood. Lim's radio crackled to life. The voice of Agent Wong from outside, asking for a status update. But before Lim could respond, the hallway lights, long dead for decades, began to flicker. One by one, the old bulbs overhead sputtered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow that pulsed and dimmed in erratic intervals. In that stuttering light, Lim saw her. At the far end of the hallway, standing perfectly still at the base of the staircase, was a figure in a nun's habit. The fabric was dark, almost black, and the veil hung low, obscuring her face completely. Her hands were clasped in front of her as if in prayer, but her posture was wrong, tilted slightly, her head angled too far to one side. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching them. Tan raised his flashlight, and the beam hit her directly. For a brief, horrible moment, Lim saw what was beneath the veil. It wasn't a face. It was a mass of shadows, twisting and writhing, and in the center, 2 points of pale light that might have been eyes. Then the lights went out again, plunging them into complete darkness. When Lim's flashlight finally came back on, the figure was gone, but the smell remained, stronger now, and the temperature had dropped so sharply that their breath came out in visible clouds. Tan was breathing hard, his voice shaking as he asked what they should do. Lim didn't answer. He was staring at the floor where the figure had been standing. There, burned into the tile in the same scorched lettering as the chapel walls, were 3 words. Nos te vocamus. We call you. They ran. There was no shame in it, no hesitation. Lim and Tan sprinted through the entrance hall and out into the courtyard, their lungs burning, their hearts hammering. The other agents rushed toward them, asking what happened, but Lim couldn't find the words. He was still trying to process what he had seen, what he had felt in that hallway. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something that reached into the oldest parts of his mind and whispered that he was not meant to be here, that this place belonged to something else. The team regrouped quickly, and Lim made the call to evacuate and seal the building. They would analyze the footage, review the evidence, and decide on next steps from a safe distance. But as they loaded their equipment into the van, Agent Wong approached Lim with a tablet in hand. He had been monitoring the drone feed remotely, and he had something Lim needed to see. The footage was from just minutes ago, recorded while Lim and Tan were inside. The thermal imaging showed the second-floor corridor, the same location from the original sighting. And there, clear as anything, was the heat signature again. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were 5 more figures, all walking upside down along the ceiling, all moving in perfect synchronization toward the stairwell. And at the center of them, one figure stood still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her arms spread wide as if welcoming something. Lim watched the screen in silence, his mind racing. Whatever was inside St. Catherine's, it wasn't just one entity. It was many, and they were organized. The case was officially closed 3 weeks later. The federal government issued a statement citing structural instability and environmental hazards, and the building was demolished under heavy security. No media was allowed near the site, and all footage from the investigation was classified. But Lim knew the truth. He had seen the reports from the forensic team that examined the chapel. The scorched words on the walls weren't just burned into the plaster, they had been burned through it, into the stone beneath, with a heat source that reached over 1,500 degrees Celsius. No accelerant had been used. No tool could have created those marks. And then there was the matter of Agent Lim himself. He had returned home that night, exhausted and shaken, and collapsed into bed without even removing his shoes. When he woke the next morning, he felt a strange tightness in his throat. At first, he thought it was dehydration, but when he tried to drink water, he couldn't swallow. His wife found him in the bathroom, clutching the sink, his face pale and his lips trembling. She called an ambulance immediately. At the hospital, doctors discovered something that defied medical explanation. Lim's throat was filled with liquid, clear and odorless, that tested as pure water. But it wasn't in his stomach. It was in his trachea, his larynx, pooling in places where liquid should never be. Worse, his lips had been sewn shut from the inside. The stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, made from a material that dissolved under examination. He survived, but he never spoke again. The damage to his vocal cords was irreversible, and the psychological trauma left him unable to return to work. The last entry in his personal journal, written the night before he was hospitalized, contained only one sentence. I heard her voice in my sleep, and she told me I had been chosen. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it's far from the only one. In another part of Asia, something equally disturbing took place, this time in the heart of one of the world's most modern cities. What began as a routine investigation into missing tenants would uncover something far more sinister, something that defied logic and left investigators questioning the very nature of the walls around them. Because sometimes the most terrifying places aren't ancient ruins or abandoned schools. Sometimes they're the apartments we live in every single day. Detective Park Joon-ho had been with the Seoul Metropolitan Police for 18 years, and he prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure. He had worked homicides, organized crime, and cases involving some of the city's darkest secrets, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the call that came in on a cold February morning. The report was simple on the surface. 3 tenants from the same luxury apartment building in Gangnam had gone missing over the span of 6 months, all without a trace. No signs of struggle, no belongings taken, no indication that they had planned to leave. The building management had been reluctant to report it, fearing bad publicity in one of Seoul's most expensive districts. But when a 4th tenant failed to show up for work and didn't answer any calls, the case was finally escalated. Park was assigned to lead the investigation, and his first visit to the building left him with an uneasy feeling he couldn't quite explain. The apartment complex was sleek and modern, all glass and steel with a polished lobby and security cameras covering every angle. It was the kind of place where wealthy professionals lived, where safety and privacy were guaranteed, or so the marketing materials claimed. Yet something about the building felt wrong, not in any obvious way, but in the small details. The way the lobby lights flickered intermittently, the faint smell of something stale in the air, despite the spotless appearance, the way the security guard avoided making eye contact when Park asked about the missing tenants. The first missing person was a woman named Lee Minji, a 32-year-old marketing executive who lived alone in apartment 1107. According to her employer, she had simply stopped coming to work in early September. Her phone went straight to voicemail, her social media accounts went silent, and when building security finally opened her door at the request of her worried colleagues, they found the apartment completely undisturbed. Her clothes were in the closet. Her laptop was on the dining table. Her keys and wallet were on the kitchen counter. It was as if she had stepped out for a moment and never returned, except there was no evidence she had ever left. The second disappearance happened in late October. A man named Kim Tae-wook, a 28-year-old software engineer who lived in apartment 0914. His case was nearly identical. He missed a major project deadline, stopped responding to messages, and when his manager contacted the building, they found his apartment in the same eerie state of normalcy. Everything was in place, everything was clean, but Kim Tae-wook was gone. The third case was in December, and by then, the building management could no longer ignore the pattern. Park reviewed the files carefully, looking for connections. All 3 victims lived alone. All 3 had no close family in Seoul, and all 3 had moved into the building within the same year. But beyond that, there was nothing. No shared acquaintances, no financial troubles, no history of mental illness or erratic behavior. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives until they simply ceased to exist. The fourth victim was what finally brought Park and his team into the building with full authority to investigate. Her name was Choi Hae-jin, a 29-year-old attorney who worked at a prestigious law firm downtown. Unlike the others, her disappearance was noticed immediately. She missed a court appearance, which was unthought of, and when her assistant couldn't reach her, the firm contacted the police directly. Park arrived at her apartment, number 1511, with 2 officers and a forensic technician. The building manager unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. The apartment was immaculate. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a tastefully decorated living room with modern furniture and carefully chosen art on the walls. There was a half-empty cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, still faintly warm to the touch. A book lay open on the sofa, a bookmark placed halfway through. It looked like someone had been there just minutes ago, but Choi Hae-jin was nowhere to be found. Park walked through the apartment slowly, his trained eye scanning for anything out of place. The bedroom was neat, the bed made, the closet organized. The bathroom showed no signs of struggle, no blood, no disturbance. Everything was perfectly, unnervingly normal. But then, as he stood in the center of the living room, Park noticed something. The air felt different in this apartment, heavier somehow, and there was a faint sound, so quiet he almost missed it, a low hum, like static from an old television. He asked the officers if they heard it, and they nodded slowly, their expressions uncertain. The forensic technician pulled out an audio recorder and activated it, holding it up to capture any ambient noise. The hum grew slightly louder, and then, beneath it, there was something else. A whisper. Park's pulse quickened. He motioned for everyone to stay silent, and they listened. The whisper was barely audible, a woman's voice, but the words were unclear, looping in a way that didn't sound like a recording, more like an echo that never quite faded. The forensic technician adjusted the recorder's sensitivity, and the voice became clearer. It was repeating the same phrase over and over, in Korean. I'm still inside. I'm still inside. I'm still inside. The room went cold. Park looked at the others, and he could see the fear in their eyes. One of the officers asked where the sound was coming from, but Park didn't have an answer. It seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, emanating from the walls themselves. He approached the nearest wall and pressed his palm against it. The surface was smooth and cool, standard drywall, painted in a neutral beige, but beneath his hand, he felt something, a faint vibration, rhythmic and steady, like a heartbeat. He pulled his hand back, quickly, his skin prickling with unease. The forensic technicians suggested they check behind the walls, and Park agreed. They brought in a portable scanner, the kind used to detect structural anomalies or hidden compartments, and began sweeping the living room. The results were immediate and disturbing. The scanner showed irregularities in the wall density, sections that were thicker than they should be, and within those sections, there were voids, spaces that shouldn't exist. Park made the decision to open the wall. They chose a spot in the living room where the scanner had detected the largest anomaly, and one of the officers used a utility knife to cut through the paint and drywall. The blade sliced easily through the surface, and as they peeled back the material, a smell hit them, sour and chemical, like formaldehyde. Behind the drywall, instead of insulation and studs, there was a layer of plaster, old and cracked, and pressed into that plaster, barely visible but undeniably, there was the outline of a human hand. Park felt his stomach turn. He ordered the team to stop and stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. The building was only 8 years old, constructed with modern materials and techniques, yet behind the walls there was old plaster that looked decades old, and embedded in it was the clear impression of a hand, fingers splayed, as if someone had been pushing from the inside. The forensic technician took photographs and samples, and Park called for additional support. Within the hour, a full forensic team arrived, along with structural engineers and representatives from the building management, who looked increasingly pale as they realized the scope of what was being uncovered. The decision was made to strip the wallpaper and outer layers from several walls in the apartment, and what they found defied explanation. Every wall in the living room, bedroom, and hallway contained the same thing: faint outlines of human shapes, pressed into the plaster from the inside out. Some were just hands. Others were full-body impressions, twisted and contorted, as if the person had been struggling. The shapes were inconsistent with any known construction method, and the plaster itself tested as a type that hadn't been used in South Korea since the 1972. One of the engineers suggested that the building might have been constructed on the site of an older structure, and remnants of the original walls had been incorporated into the new design. But that theory fell apart when they examined the building's blueprints. There was no older structure. The land had been vacant for decades before construction began. So, where did the plaster come from? And how did human impressions end up inside walls that were supposedly built just 8 years ago? Park ordered the investigation expanded to the other apartments where tenants had disappeared. In each one, they found the same thing: hidden layers of old plaster behind modern drywall, and within that plaster, more outlines, more impressions of hands and bodies. But in apartment 1107, where Lee Min-ji had lived, they found something worse. When they removed a section of the bedroom wall, they discovered a small cavity, roughly the size of a closet, that didn't appear on any blueprints. Inside the cavity, the plaster was scorched black, and carved into the surface in rough, desperate strokes were words in Korean. "Help me, I can't get out. I'm still inside." The handwriting was shaky, uneven, as if written in complete darkness by someone who could barely move. And at the bottom of the cavity, they found a single item, a woman's ring, engraved with the initials L.M.J. Lee Min-ji's initials. Park felt a chill run through him. The ring had been in the wall, behind layers of plaster and drywall, that should have been undisturbed since the building's construction. Yet here it was, as if Min-ji had somehow been inside the wall itself. The theory was impossible, insane, but the evidence was right in front of them. The other apartments yielded similar findings. personal items belonging to the missing tenants, small things like earrings, pens, a watch, all found within the walls, embedded in plaster that shouldn't exist. It was as if the building had swallowed them, pulled them into the walls and trapped them there, leaving behind only these traces, these desperate messages carved into surfaces no one should have been able to reach. The investigation reached a breaking point when the forensic team attempted to remove a larger section of wall in apartment 1511, Choi Hae-jin's apartment, to fully document the extent of the anomalies. As they cut through the drywall and began to pry away the plaster beneath, the whisper returned. This time, it was louder, clearer, and it wasn't coming from a recording device. It was coming from inside the wall. "I'm still inside. I'm still inside. I'm still inside." The voice was unmistakably Choi Hae-jin's. Park recognized it from the voicemail recordings her law firm had provided. But she wasn't in the apartment. She wasn't anywhere they could see. Yet her voice was there, trapped somehow, echoing from within the structure itself. One of the forensic technicians, a young woman named Han Soo-min, leaned closer to the wall, pressing her ear against the plaster. She heard it too, not just the whisper, but something else, a faint scratching like fingernails dragging across stone. She pulled back quickly, her face pale, and told Park they needed to stop, that something was wrong. But before he could respond, the wall began to crack. It started as a thin line, barely visible, running vertically from floor to ceiling, and then it spread, branching out like a spider web. The plaster crumbled, falling away in chunks, and behind it there was movement. Park saw it clearly, a shape shifting in the darkness behind the wall, something pale and contorted pressing against the inside surface. The entire team stepped back, their breathing rapid, their eyes locked on the wall. The cracks widened, and then, with a sound like tearing fabric, a section of the wall collapsed inward. And there, in the cavity behind it, they saw her, Choi Hae-jin, or what was left of her. Her body was pressed into the plaster, her limbs twisted at impossible angles, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were open, staring at nothing. But the most horrifying detail was that she wasn't dead. Her chest was moving, shallow breaths that barely lifted her ribcage, and her fingers were twitching, scratching weakly at the plaster around her. She was alive, trapped inside the wall, alive. Park shouted for medical assistance, and the team rushed forward, trying to pull her free, but the plaster had hardened around her like cement, and every attempt to move her caused her to let out a low, agonized moan that barely sounded human. It took nearly an hour to extract her, and by the time they did, she had stopped breathing. The paramedics tried to resuscitate her, but it was too late. Choi Hae-jin was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy revealed that her body had been subjected to extreme compression, her bones fractured in multiple places, her internal organs damaged, as if she had been slowly crushed over a period of days. But the cause of death was listed as asphyxiation. She had suffocated, trapped inside a wall that shouldn't have been able to hold her, in a building that was supposed to be safe. Park couldn't sleep for days after that. He kept hearing her voice in his mind, that looping whisper. "I'm still inside." The case was never officially solved. The building was evacuated and eventually condemned, though no public explanation was ever given. The official report cited structural defects and safety violations, and the residents were relocated without question. But Park knew the truth, or at least part of it. Something about that building was wrong. Something that existed beneath the surface, hidden in the walls, waiting. And the whispers hadn't stopped. Even after the building was sealed, Park received reports from nearby residents who claimed they could still hear voices at night, faint and distant, calling out from the condemned structure. Some said they heard their own names. Park retired early, unable to continue his work after what he had seen. But he kept the case file, and in his private notes, he wrote one final observation. The building wasn't just swallowing people, it was keeping them. Alive and aware, trapped in the walls, whispering endlessly into the void. And somewhere inside that structure, the others were still there too. Lee Min-ji, Kim Tai-wook, the first tenant whose name had been lost to time. All of them, still inside, still trying to answer back. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to a darker and more mysterious level. Because in the next part, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying, where the line between the living and the dead grows thin, and where those who seek answers find themselves facing truths that were never meant to be uncovered. The horror is far from over, and what lies ahead will test the limits of what we believe is possible. The camera was installed on a Friday afternoon in early November. Hidden inside what appeared to be a smoke detector mounted on the ceiling of room 404 inches, the Suganami Ward apartment complex. Detective Nakamura Kenji had overseen the installation himself, ensuring that the lens was positioned to capture the entire room, from the narrow entryway to the tatami mat flooring and the small futon folded neatly in the corner. The apartment had been vacant for 3 months, ever since the last tenant, a 26-year-old schoolteacher named Tanaka Yuri, had been found dead in the bathtub with her wrists cut. She was the third suicide in that apartment in less than 2 years, and the building's landlord had finally agreed to let the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Paranormal Investigation Unit conduct a surveillance operation. Nakamura had worked in the unit for 6 years, long enough to know that some places carried something darker than bad luck. Room 404 was one of those places. He had reviewed the case files extensively, studied the patterns, and spoken to the families of the deceased. What he found was always the same. Each victim had been healthy, stable, with no history of depression or suicidal ideation. Yet all 3 had taken their own lives in the same apartment, in the same way, as if following an invisible script. The surveillance was meant to capture anything unusual, any signs of environmental factors, or external interference that might explain the deaths. What it captured instead was something that would haunt Nakamura for the rest of his life. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Paranormal Investigation Unit was not widely known to the public, and that was by design. Officially, it operated as a subdivision of the Criminal Investigation Bureau, but its cases were rarely acknowledged in official reports. The unit had been formed in the late 1982, during a period when Tokyo experienced a wave of unexplained deaths and mass hysteria incidents that couldn't be solved through conventional methods. The Japanese government, pragmatic and discreet, decided that such cases required specialized attention, and so the unit was born, staffed by detectives, forensic experts, psychologists, and cultural historians who understood that some phenomena existed outside the boundaries of rational explanation. Nakamura had joined the unit after a personal experience during his time as a regular homicide detective, an encounter with something he couldn't explain and had never spoken about publicly. He believed in evidence, in documentation, in the careful collection of facts, but he also believed that the world contained things that science had not yet learned to measure. Room 404 was his 9th active case, and from the beginning it felt different. The building itself was unremarkable, a 4-story concrete structure built in the 1972nd, located in a quiet residential neighborhood near the train station. The other tenants were ordinary people, salarymen and office workers, retirees and students, none of them reporting anything unusual beyond the suicides. But room 404 sat at the end of the 4th-floor hallway, isolated from the other units, and those who had lived there before the recent deaths described feeling uncomfortable, watched, as if the apartment itself were aware of their presence. The landlord, an elderly man named Sato, had tried to rent the apartment after each death, lowering the price each time, but no tenant stayed longer than a few months before moving out, citing vague reasons, bad dreams, unease, a feeling that they weren't alone. After Tanaka Yuri's death, Sato had given up and left the apartment empty, and that was when Nakamura had approached him with the proposal for surveillance. The footage from the first 3 nights showed nothing unusual. The apartment remained still and dark, the camera's infrared mode capturing the empty room in grainy shades of gray. Nakamura reviewed the recordings each morning, scanning for any movement, any anomaly, but there was nothing. On the 4th night, something changed. At exactly 2:43 in the morning, the camera recorded a shift in the room's ambient light. It was subtle, a faint darkening in the far corner near the closet, as if a shadow had detached itself from the wall. Nakamura paused the footage and rewound it, watching the moment again. The shadow didn't appear suddenly. It seemed to seep into existence, growing denser over the course of several seconds until it formed a shape that resembled a seated figure. It was humanoid but indistinct, its edges blurred, and it sat motionless on the tatami mat near the futon, facing the center of the room. Nakamura felt a chill run down his spine. He checked the timestamp and the camera's diagnostic data. Everything was functioning normally. No glitches, no interference. The shadow was there, captured clearly on the recording. He continued watching. For nearly an hour, the shadow remained in the same position, unmoving, and then, at 3:37 in the morning, it turned its head. The motion was slow and deliberate, a smooth rotation that brought the shape's featureless face toward the camera. Nakamura's breath caught in his throat. The shadow was looking directly at the lens, as if it knew it was being watched. For several seconds, it stayed like that, its head tilted slightly, and then the footage corrupted. The screen filled with static, the image breaking apart into flickering pixels, and when it cleared, the shadow was gone. Nakamura reported the findings to his supervisor, Lieutenant Hayashi, who authorized a second camera installation and a site inspection. The next day, Nakamura returned to the apartment with 2 technicians and a forensic specialist. They examined the room thoroughly, checking for any signs of tampering or environmental factors that could have caused the shadow on the footage. The tatami mats were old but intact. The walls showed no signs of moisture or mold, and there were no reflective surfaces that could have created an optical illusion. Everything was as it should be, yet when they examined the spot where the shadow had been sitting, they found something that made Nakamura's pulse quicken. Burned into the surface of the tatami mat, barely visible but unmistakable when viewed up close, were deep impressions, 5 distinct marks arranged in the pattern of a hand, as if something with immense weight had pressed down on the mat with its fingers. The impressions weren't fresh. The tatami fibers around them were discolored and brittle, as if they had been burned slowly over a long period of time. Decades, perhaps. Yet the mat itself had only been installed 8 years ago when the apartment was last renovated. The forensic specialist took samples and photographs, but even she seemed unsettled by the find. There was no scientific explanation for how those marks had formed, no heat source in the apartment, no way for such deep impressions to exist without visible damage to the surrounding material. Nakamura ordered the second camera installed in a different location, this time positioned lower to capture a wider angle of the floor, and he decided to spend a night in the apartment himself. It was against protocol, but he needed to understand what was happening, and the only way to do that was to experience it firsthand. He arrived at room 404 just after sunset, carrying a sleeping bag, a thermos of coffee, and a flashlight. The apartment was cold despite the mild weather outside, and the air felt stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in months. Nakamura set up his equipment in the center of the room, placing a portable recorder on the floor and positioning himself against the wall where he could see the entire space. The building was quiet, the other tenants settled in for the night, and Nakamura waited. For the first few hours, nothing happened. He drank his coffee, reviewed his notes, and listened to the faint sounds of the city beyond the window. But as the clock neared 2 a.m, the temperature dropped sharply. Nakamura's breath began to fog in the air, and he felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He turned on his flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should be, deeper, as if they were absorbing the light, rather than reflecting it. Then he heard it, a faint scraping sound, like fabric dragging across the floor. It came from the corner near the closet, the same spot where the shadow had appeared in the footage. Nakamura's hand tightened on the flashlight, and he stood slowly, keeping his back to the wall. The scraping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, and then it stopped. In the silence that followed, Nakamura saw movement. A shape, darker than the surrounding darkness, was sitting on the tatami mat, exactly where the impressions had been found. It was the same figure from the footage, hunched and motionless, its head bowed as if in contemplation. Nakamura's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He raised the flashlight and aimed it directly at the figure. The beam passed through it without resistance, illuminating the wall beyond, but the shadow remained, solid and present. It didn't react to the light. It simply sat there, as it had for who knows how long, waiting. Nakamura took a step forward, his training overriding his fear. He spoke aloud, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, asking if anyone was there, if the figure could hear him. There was no response, but the shadow's head began to move. It lifted slowly, tilting upward as if raising its gaze to meet his, and Nakamura saw what lay beneath. There was no face, no features, just a void, an absence of light so absolute that it seemed to pull at his vision, drawing him in. He felt a wave of nausea and staggered back, breaking eye contact, and when he looked again, the shadow had shifted. It was standing now, its form taller than he had realized, towering over the spot where it had been sitting. It didn't move toward him, didn't make any threatening gestures, but its presence filled the room, oppressive and suffocating. Nakamura felt his chest tighten, his breathing shallow, and a single thought echoed in his mind, unbidden and intrusive. You shouldn't be here. He didn't know if the thought was his own or if it had been placed there, but the certainty of it was overwhelming. He backed toward the door, keeping his eyes on the shadow, and as he reached for the handle, the figure's head turned again, following his movement with that same slow, deliberate rotation. Nakamura yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind him. He stood there for several minutes, his hands shaking, his mind racing. When he finally gathered the courage to open the door again, the apartment was empty. The shadow was gone, and the temperature had returned to normal. But on the tatami mat, in the exact spot where the figure had been standing, there were new impressions. This time, the outline of 2 feet burned deep into the surface. The investigation concluded 2 weeks later, though Nakamura knew they had barely scratched the surface of what was happening in room 404. The The forensic analysis of the impressions revealed that they had been created by extreme localized heat, temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Yet there was no scorching on the surrounding tatami, no residue, no explanation for how such heat could have been generated without destroying the entire mat. The recordings from the second camera captured the same shadow on 3 separate occasions, always appearing at the same time, always sitting in the same spot, always turning its head toward the lens before the footage corrupted. After Nakamura's experience in the apartment, the unit's psychologist conducted an evaluation and recommended that no further personnel enter the room without extensive psychological preparation and support. The building's landlord, Sato, was advised to permanently seal the apartment, and he complied without question. Room 404 was boarded up, the door reinforced, and a notice was posted citing structural concerns. The other tenants were not informed of the true reason, and life in the building continued as normal. But Nakamura, he couldn't let it go. He spent months researching the history of the land, digging through municipal records, old newspapers, and family archives. What he discovered was a pattern that stretched back over a century. The site where the apartment building stood had once been home to a small Buddhist temple, demolished in the early 1900s to make way for residential development. The temple had been dedicated to the veneration of ancestors, and its monks had practiced a form of meditation meant to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. According to local lore, one of the monks had refused to leave when the temple was torn down, sitting in silent protest on the exact spot where room 404 would eventually be built. He had died there, alone and forgotten, and some believed his spirit had never moved on. Nakamura didn't know if he believed in ghosts, but he knew what he had seen, and he knew that whatever was in room 404 had been there far longer than any of the recent tenants. It had been sitting, watching, waiting, for decades, perhaps centuries, and it showed no sign of leaving. The case was filed under Document 404 and classified, accessible only to members of the paranormal unit and select government officials. Nakamura left the unit 6 months later, citing personal reasons, though those who knew him understood that his encounter in room 404 had changed him. He refused to discuss the details publicly, but in his final report, he included one observation that haunted his colleagues. "The shadow wasn't malicious," he wrote. "It wasn't trying to harm anyone. It was simply there, existing in a space that no longer belonged to it, unable to move on, unable to let go." And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all, the idea that some things remain, trapped between worlds, watching endlessly, waiting for something that will never come. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But that story, as unsettling as it is, leads us to something even stranger. Something that defies the boundaries between the living and the dead in ways that are difficult to comprehend. Because what happens when the dead don't just linger in places, but appear in moments frozen in time, captured on tape, watching from within the reflections of those who have committed the most unforgivable acts? The next story takes us to the Philippines, where investigators discovered something in their own footage that they were never meant to see. The tape arrived at the Manila Central Police Station on a humid afternoon in late August 1998, delivered by courier from the National Bureau of Investigation's Audiovisual Forensics Department. Detective Reyes had been expecting it for weeks, ever since the interrogation of a suspect named Eduardo Salcedo, a 42-year-old construction foreman, accused of the abduction and murder of an 8-year-old boy named Miguel Torres. The case had drawn national attention not only because of its brutality, but because Salcedo had confessed almost immediately after his arrest, describing details of the crime that only the killer could have known. The confession had been recorded on video as standard procedure, and the footage was meant to be used as evidence in the trial. But when the forensics team reviewed the tape for quality and clarity, they noticed something in the background, something that shouldn't have been there. They had flagged it, enhanced the footage, and sent it to Reyes with a note that simply read, "You need to see this." Reyes had been a detective for over 20 years, and he had worked more child murder cases than he cared to count. Each one left scars, but he had learned to compartmentalize, to focus on the evidence and the pursuit of justice, rather than the horror of what people were capable of doing to the, quote, innocent. But when he inserted the tape into the VHS player in the station's small viewing room and pressed play, what he saw on the screen made his blood run cold. The interrogation room was standard, a small concrete space with a metal table, 2 chairs, and a single camera mounted in the corner to record everything. Salcedo sat on one side of the table, his hands cuffed in front of him, his expression blank and unreadable. Across from him sat Detective Ocampo, a veteran investigator known for his ability to extract confessions even from the most hardened criminals. The interrogation had lasted 4 hours, and the footage Reyes was watching was from the final 30 minutes, the segment where Salcedo had broken down and admitted to the murder. He spoke in a flat, emotionless tone, describing how he had lured the boy into a construction site, how he had strangled him, how he had disposed of the body in a shallow grave near the river. It was all there, clear and damning, and it should have been more than enough to secure a conviction. But Reyes wasn't focused on Salcedo. He was looking at the space behind him, just over his left shoulder, where the wall met the corner of the room. At first, there was nothing, just the blank surface of the concrete. But as Salcedo continued his confession, something began to appear. It started as a faint distortion, like heat waves rising from pavement, and then it took shape. A child, a boy, standing perfectly still, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes hollow and dark. He was dressed in a simple t-shirt and shorts, the same clothes Miguel Torres had been wearing when he disappeared. His face was wet, streaked with what looked like tears, though his expression never changed. He simply stood there, unmoving, staring directly at the camera. Reyes felt his chest tighten. He paused the tape and rewound it, watching the moment again. The boy appeared gradually, frame by frame, as if materializing out of the air, and he remained visible for the rest of the interrogation, standing behind Salcedo like a silent witness. Reyes called Detective Ocampo into the viewing room and played the tape for him. Ocampo watched in silence, his face pale, and when the footage ended, he simply shook his head. He hadn't seen the boy during the interrogation, he said. None of them had. The room had been empty, except for him and Salcedo, and the camera had been the only other presence. Reyes asked if anyone else had been in the station that day, if there was any possibility that a child had wandered into the interrogation area, but Ocampo was adamant. It was impossible. The interrogation wing was secured, locked from the inside, and no one without clearance could have entered. Besides, he added, if a child had been standing in the room, they would have seen him. The tape was sent for further analysis, and the forensics team confirmed what Reyes already suspected. The boy in the footage was not a result of camera malfunction or video interference. He was there, captured clearly on tape, and his appearance coincided exactly with the moment Salcedo began confessing to the murder. But the most disturbing detail came when the team enhanced the image and examined it frame by frame. The boy wasn't standing behind Salcedo in the physical sense. He was inside the reflection on the wall, visible only in the faint sheen of moisture that had condensed on the concrete surface. When they adjusted the contrast and brightness, they could see him more clearly, his hollow eyes staring not at the camera, but at Salcedo himself, as if accusing him, as if waiting for something. The discovery prompted Reyes to review other interrogation footage from recent cases, specifically those involving suspects accused of crimes against children. What he found sent shockwaves through the department. In tape after tape, the boy appeared, always in the same way, always standing behind the suspect, always visible only in reflections, in windows, in polished tabletops, in the glass of a water pitcher. He was never in the room itself, only in the reflections, and he always appeared at the same moment, when the suspect began confessing or displaying guilt. The boy's appearance was consistent across all the tapes, the same pale face, the same wet cheeks, the same hollow eyes. It was as if he were following these cases, drawn to them, bearing witness to the crimes that had stolen his life. Reyes compiled the footage and presented it to his superiors, along with a formal request to investigate the phenomenon further. The response was immediate and unequivocal. The footage was classified, access restricted, and all copies were to be secured. Reyes was told to drop the matter and focus on building the case against Salcedo, but he couldn't let it go. He needed to understand what the boy was, why he was appearing, and what it meant. Against orders, he reached out to a psychic liaison, a woman named Elena Santos, who had worked with the police on several high-profile cases involving hauntings and unexplained phenomena. Elena had a reputation for being able to communicate with spirits, and Reyes hoped she could provide answers. They met at the station late one evening, long after the other officers had gone home. Reyes set up the viewing room and played the tapes for Elena, watching her face as the boy appeared on screen. She didn't react with fear or surprise, only a deep, sorrowful acknowledgement, as if she had expected to see something like this. When the footage ended, she sat in silence for several minutes, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. The boy was not Miguel Torres, she said. He was older, much older, a spirit who had been trapped in this world for decades, perhaps longer, drawn to the pain and suffering of children who had experienced what he had. He was a witness, she explained, a guardian of sorts, appearing in moments of confession because he wanted the truth to be known, wanted justice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. But he was also angry, Elena added, angry at the men who had harmed him and others like him, and his presence was not benign. It was a warning, a condemnation, and those who saw him, even through the lens of a camera, would feel the weight of his judgment. Reyes asked if there was a way to communicate with the boy, to ask him what he wanted, and Elena agreed to try. She requested that the lights in the viewing room be dimmed and the tape be played one more time. As the footage rolled, she closed her eyes and began to whisper, speaking in Tagalog, addressing the boy directly, asking him to make his presence known, to give them a sign. For several minutes, nothing happened. The tape played on, Salcedo's confession echoing through the small room, and the boy remained frozen on the screen, his expression unchanged. Then, without warning, the power went out. The television screen went black, the overhead lights flickered and died, and the room was plunged into complete darkness. Reyes fumbled for his flashlight, his heart racing, but before he could turn it on, he heard Elena gasp. When the emergency lights finally kicked in, casting a dim red glow over the room, Reyes saw that Elena was trembling, her face pale and slick with sweat. She was staring at the television screen, though it was still dark and lifeless, and when Reyes asked her what she had seen, she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "He's not behind them," she said. "He's inside them, inside their reflection. And he's not alone. There are others, so many others." The power returned a few minutes later, But the tape had been damaged, the footage corrupted beyond recovery. Elena refused to discuss what she had experienced in the darkness, and she left the station shortly after, declining any further involvement in the case. Reyes tried to follow up with her in the days that followed, but she wouldn't return his calls. And when he finally went to her home, he found it empty. Her neighbors saying she had left the city without explanation. The case against Eduardo Salcedo proceeded without incident, and he was convicted based on his confession and the physical evidence recovered from the construction site. He was sentenced to life in prison, and the case was officially closed. But the tape, the original footage of his interrogation, was never presented in court. It remained classified, stored in a secure vault in the National Bureau of Investigation's headquarters, accessible only to a handful of authorized personnel. Reyes continued his work, but the experience haunted him. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy, about the others Elena had mentioned, about what it meant for those spirits to be trapped inside reflections, watching, waiting, unable to move on. He began to notice things in his own cases, small details that he had overlooked before, in photographs taken at crime scenes, faint shapes in windows and mirrors. In interview footage, fleeting shadows that appeared and disappeared between frames. He started to wonder how many other spirits were out there, how many victims were still watching, still waiting for justice, still crying out from the places where they had been forgotten. The final entry in Reyes's case file, written just before his retirement in 2003, contained a note that was never meant to be part of the official record. He described a dream he had been having repeatedly since the night Elena had come to the station. In the dream, he was standing in the interrogation room alone, and when he looked at the walls, he saw dozens of reflections staring back at him, children with hollow eyes and wet faces, all of them silent, all of them watching, and in the dream, he realized that they weren't just reflections. They were prisoners, trapped in the glass, in the metal, in the surfaces that held their images, unable to break free, unable to rest. He woke from the dream each time with the same thought, a question that had no answer. If the dead could be trapped in reflections, then how many of them were looking back at us every single day, unseen and unheard, waiting for someone to notice? I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last two stories are different. They're quieter, but far more disturbing. The kind that stay with you long after the telling ends. Because sometimes, horror doesn't announce itself with screams or violence. Sometimes, it seeps in slowly, through the cracks in everyday life, through the things we take for granted, the things we see but don't truly notice. What comes next will test the boundaries of what we believe about the world we live in, and what lies just beyond the edges of our perception, waiting. The message arrived at the Bureau of National Security's Special Investigations Division at 4:37 in the morning on the 14th of October 2015. It was a single line of text sent from the mobile phone of Dr. Chen Wei, the lead archaeologist overseeing the excavation of a planned subway extension near the outskirts of Xi'an in Shaanxi Province. The message read simply. It opened itself. There was no context, no explanation, and no follow-up communication. When the Bureau's duty officer tried to call Dr. Chen back, the line went straight to voicemail. A second attempt 30 minutes later yielded the same result. By dawn, a rapid response team had been dispatched to the excavation site, a 50-acre stretch of farmland that had been cordoned off 3 weeks earlier, when construction crews had discovered what appeared to be remnants of an ancient structure buried 12 meters below the surface. The site had been flagged as archaeologically significant, and Dr. Chen's team had been brought in to assess and document the findings before construction could resume. What they had found was unlike anything in the historical record: a massive bronze gate, over 4 meters tall and 3 meters wide, covered entirely in intricate Taoist sigils and inscriptions that dated back to the late Han Dynasty, nearly 2,000 years ago. The gate had been sealed with molten bronze, its surface smooth and unbroken, and preliminary analysis suggested it had been deliberately buried, hidden beneath layers of compacted earth and stone, as if someone had wanted to ensure it would never be found. But now, according to Dr. Chen's cryptic message, it had opened, and no one knew what that meant. The Bureau of National Security's Special Investigations Division operated in the shadows of the Chinese government, tasked with handling cases that fell outside the purview of conventional law enforcement or military intelligence. These were incidents involving mass hysteria, unexplained disappearances, and phenomena that threatened public stability but could not be addressed through ordinary means. The division had been established in the early 1952s, during a period when rapid industrialization and urban expansion had unearthed countless relics and sites from China's ancient past, some of which carried with them stories and superstitions that the government preferred to keep contained. Over the decades, the division had investigated hundreds of cases, most of which were quietly resolved and filed away, never to be spoken of again. But certain cases, the ones deemed too sensitive or too inexplicable, were classified under the designation Black File, accessible only to the highest levels of government and never to be disclosed to the public. The excavation site near Xi'an was about to become Black File 32. The rapid response team consisted of 6 agents, led by senior investigator Lu Feng, a man in his early 50s with a reputation for remaining calm under pressure and an uncanny ability to assess situations others found incomprehensible. Liu had been with the division for over 20 years, and he had seen things that would have broken lesser men: entire villages abandoned overnight, underground chambers filled with bones arranged in patterns that defied explanation, witnesses who spoke of seeing things that should not exist. He approached each case with a mixture of skepticism and open-mindedness, understanding that the world was far stranger than most people were willing to admit. As the team's vehicle approached the excavation site just after sunrise, Liu could see that something was wrong. The site should have been busy with workers preparing for the day's excavation, but it was completely deserted. The construction equipment sat idle, the generators silent, and the temporary shelters where the crew had been staying were empty, their doors hanging open. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of panic, just an eerie stillness that hung over the entire area, like a shroud. Liu and his team exited the vehicle and began a systematic search of the site. The excavation pit was located in the center of the cordoned area, a massive rectangular hole surrounded by scaffolding and safety barriers. As they approached the edge, Liu could see the bronze gate at the bottom, partially exposed, its surface gleaming dully in the morning light. And he could see immediately that Dr. Chen's message had been accurate. The gate was open, not just unsealed, but standing ajar, one of its massive panels tilted outward at an angle, revealing a dark space beyond. The molten bronze seal that had held it shut for centuries had cracked cleanly down the middle, the edges of the break smooth and precise, as if the gate had been opened from the inside with a force so immense that the metal had simply sheared apart. Liu felt a knot form in his stomach. He motioned for 2 of his agents to descend into the pit, while the others secured the perimeter and began documenting the scene. The descent was slow and careful, the agents using the scaffolding ladders to climb down into the excavation. When they reached the bottom, they radioed back to Liu, their voices tight with tension. The area around the gate was covered in footprints, dozens of them, all belonging to the workers and archaeologists who had been on site. But the footprints didn't lead away from the gate or toward the ladders. They circled it, over and over, in endless loops, as if the people who had made them had been walking in circles around the gate for hours. Some of the prints overlapped, creating chaotic patterns, while others were spaced evenly, almost rhythmically, as if whoever had made them had been moving with a deliberate trance-like purpose. There were no signs of the workers themselves, no abandoned tools, no personal belongings, just the footprints and the open gate. Liu ordered the agents to hold their position and called for additional support, including a forensic team and specialists in historical and religious artifacts. While they waited, he descended into the pit himself, needing to see the gate up close. As he approached, the air around him grew noticeably colder, and he became aware of a sound, faint at first but growing louder as he neared the opening. It was a low, resonant hum, almost like wind moving through a narrow passage, but it seemed to be coming from inside the gate, rising upward from the darkness beyond. Liu shone his flashlight through the opening, and what he saw made his breath catch. Beyond the gate was a shaft, carved directly into the bedrock, descending straight down into the earth. The walls were smooth and covered in the same Taoist sigils that adorned the gate itself, and the shaft was deep, far deeper than the 20 meters the excavation had reached. Liu's flashlight beam couldn't penetrate to the bottom, the darkness swallowing the light entirely, and the wind he had heard was indeed coming from below, a steady, upward current of cold air that carried with it a smell he couldn't quite identify, something ancient and mineral, like stone that had been sealed away from the world for millennia. One of the agents knelt beside the gate and examined the broken seal more closely, running his gloved fingers over the smooth edges of the crack. He reported that the break was too clean to have been caused by natural deterioration or external force. It looked deliberate, precise, as if something had pushed the gate open from the inside with enough strength to snap the bronze cleanly in two. Liu asked if there was any way to determine when the gate had opened, and the agent shook his head. The footprints suggested it had happened recently, within the last 12 hours, but there was no way to be certain. The forensic team arrived within the hour, along with a specialist in ancient Chinese religious practices, Professor Wang, a scholar from Beijing University who had consulted with the division on several previous cases. Professor Wang descended into the pit and examined the gate in silence, his face pale and drawn as he studied the inscriptions. When Liu asked him what the sigils meant, Wang took a long moment before answering. The inscriptions, he explained, were not decorative. They were warnings, written in an archaic form of Chinese that predated even the Han Dynasty. The symbols spoke of something sealed below, something that must never be released, and the gate itself had been designed not to keep people out, but to keep something in. The inscriptions referred to it as the Devourer of the 10 Directions, a term Wang said was associated with ancient demonology and the belief in entities that existed outside the natural order, beings that fed on the living and could not be destroyed by conventional means. The gate, Wang continued, had been placed here as a prison, and the Taoist priests who had built it had poured all their knowledge and power into ensuring it would remain sealed forever. But something had broken that seal, and now the gate stood open. Liu asked what Wang thought had happened to the workers, and the professor's answer was chilling. If the old texts were to be believed, he said, anyone who came too close to the gate when it opened would be drawn to it, compelled to walk in circles around it, until they were consumed, pulled into the darkness below to feed whatever had been imprisoned there. The footprints, Wang suggested, were the last traces of people who no longer existed. The decision was made to seal the site immediately. Liu ordered his team to evacuate the pit and establish a secure perimeter around the entire excavation area. Heavy equipment was brought in, and over the course of the next 3 days, the pit was filled with concrete, layer after layer, until the gate and the shaft beneath it were completely buried. The entire site was then covered with additional earth and reinforced with steel plating, and a false narrative was created to explain the sudden halt in construction. The official story was that unstable ground conditions had been discovered, making the area unsuitable for development, and the subway extension was rerouted to avoid the location entirely. The workers and archaeologists who had been on site were declared missing, and their families were told that they had likely abandoned their posts and fled, though no evidence of this was ever found. The case was classified as Black File 32, and all records of the excavation were sealed. The site itself was renamed Black Site 32 and placed under permanent surveillance, monitored remotely by the division to ensure that no one attempted to excavate or disturb the area. But the story didn't end there. In the weeks following the sealing, several of the agents who had been present at the site began to report strange experiences. Liu himself was the first. He started having dreams, vivid and recurring, in which he stood at the edge of the open gate, staring down into the shaft below. In the dreams, he could hear voices calling to him from the darkness, dozens of them, all speaking at once, begging him to come closer, to step through the gate and join them. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing, and the feeling of being watched would linger for hours afterward. Other agents reported similar dreams, and one, a younger officer named Zhang, became so disturbed that he requested a leave of absence and eventually resigned from the division altogether. Professor Wang fared no better. He returned to Beijing after the site was sealed, but his colleagues noticed a change in him. He became withdrawn, obsessed with researching the inscriptions he had seen on the gate, spending long hours in the university's archives, searching for references to the devourer of the 10 directions. He filled notebooks with translations and theories, trying to piece together the history of the gate and what it had been built to contain. But the more he learned, the more unsettled he became. He told a colleague, in confidence, that he believed the gate had not opened by accident, that something had been waiting for centuries, growing stronger, until it finally had the power to break free. And now that it was free, he said, it would not stop. It would spread, slowly and silently, consuming everything in its path, until there was nothing left. The colleague dismissed his concerns as paranoia brought on by stress, but when Professor Wang failed to show up for a scheduled lecture 2 weeks later, a search was conducted. His apartment was found empty, his research materials scattered across the floor, and on the wall above his desk, written in what appeared to be charcoal, was a single phrase repeated over and over. "It calls from below. It calls from below. It calls from below." Professor Wang was never found, and his disappearance was quietly added to the Black File 32 report. Liu Feng continued to work for the division for another 3 years, but the case haunted him. He kept a copy of the sealed file in his personal records, reviewing it periodically, searching for anything he might have missed, any clue that could explain what had really happened at the excavation site. He became convinced that sealing the gate had not solved the problem, that whatever had been released was still out there, waiting. In his final report before his retirement in 2018, Liu included a note that was never officially acknowledged. He described a pattern he had noticed in the months and years following the sealing of Black Site 32. Across Shaanxi province and the surrounding regions, there had been a subtle but measurable increase in missing persons cases, all involving individuals who had been last seen near construction sites or underground areas. The disappearances were spread out over a wide geographic area and seemed unrelated on the surface. But Lou believed they were connected. He believed that the devourer, or whatever it was that had been sealed, beneath the gate, had found a way to move through the earth, through the tunnels and cavities, and forgotten spaces that lay beneath the cities and towns, reaching up to claim the living one by one. His superiors dismissed his theory, attributing the increase in disappearances to mundane factors like economic migration and human trafficking. But Lou knew better. He had seen the gate. He had felt the wind rising from the shaft below, and he knew, with a certainty that bordered on faith, that the gate had not opened by accident. It had been opened from the inside. And whatever had opened, it was still down there, waiting, growing, spreading its influence like roots through the bedrock, patient and relentless. The last entry in Lou's personal journal, dated 1 week before his retirement, contained a single sentence that was never shared with anyone. If they ever try to excavate that site again, they will unleash something that cannot be stopped, and by then it will be too late to seal it, to away. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.